those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Nick Archer. I am the full-time political science faculty here. I must admit this is the first time I've given a talk at a lecture hall in almost 2 years. Feels good to do it as an actual professor and not a graduate student. The lecture I'm going to give today is called The Vanishing Middle Class. This is a lecture that I actually give in my introductory government and politics class, and I actually think the title we've given it today, The Vanishing Middle Class, is a bit too diplomatic and politically correct. It is not what I call this lecture on the syllabus, is it? I have one of my students here. What do we call this lecture on the syllabus? Well, yeah, the destruction, the death of the middle class. We call it the death of the middle class and its political consequences. So this was sort of the negotiated title, if you will, to make you guys come but not make you feel really depressed. But I'm operating from an assumption, which I will have to prove to you in this lecture, that the middle class in the United States, for all intents and purposes, is dead. And that there are political consequences to the death of the middle class. So really, in doing this, we have to answer a few questions. First, I have to prove, and I think I will, that indeed the middle class is dead. But we also have to understand some theoretical concepts. First is, why is the middle class essential to democracy? Again, in my introductory class, one of the books I assign is Robert Dahl, one of the leading democratic theorists in the world, his book on democracy, which says, the value of democracy matters, and there are things about democracy we should care about. One of those things is the middle class, and he explains why. I also want to ask a bit more of an esoteric question too. Esoteric, for those who mean, sort of a deeper question just to keep in mind. And that is, what is the greatest threat to democracies from concentrated, debt-based market economies? One of the arguments that Mr. Dahl advances and that a lot of democratic theorists advance is that market economies are very helpful in terms of producing the raw materials, so to speak, that get us to democracy. By the same token, they also produce a lot of negative effects. We have to decide what those are. Markets and democracy. Well, why does Mr. Dahl argue that markets help democracy? Well, he says that markets help democracy for a few reasons. The first is a decentralized or unplanned market economy does not require an overly powerful state to run it. A state which runs a command economy leaves too much power for public officials to potentially abuse. So when I say command economy, the state running the economy, what am I saying? Everyone getting their sugar in them? I saw a hand slightly go up over here. No? Well, what I'm saying is that a command economy is an economy where, whether the production is of pizza, shoes, doesn't really matter what the item is, the state, the central government is in control of making the economic decisions for the entire society. This would perhaps be called the Soviet model. We see models, perhaps, in Italy, the fascist model are similar to this. Well, the problem with command economies is that when you're putting all the economic resources in one central area, you tend to get abuse. So people who are old enough to remember the Cold War a little, even the end of it, might remember the stories of Russian diplomats and bureaucrats coming to the United States and buying a bunch of jeans because they couldn't get them in the Soviet Union. Why? Because the government doesn't understand the demand for jeans. It isn't thinking in those terms. It can't think in those terms. So what Dahl argues, and what a lot of people argue, is that a decentralized, a market economy is far preferable in producing a genuine democracy because it will be less corrupt. A decentralized system where there's a consumer over here and a producer over here, the interaction between them will produce better results for an economy and better results for creating a democracy than a state-planned economy possibly could. But that might not really be the most important point. The biggest point, I think, that Dahl makes when he says that market economies are key to developing democracies is that market economies tend to create a middle class. A middle class of property owners who often seek to have the state, again, the central government, shore up their status through the enforcement of property rights, providing public education, allowances for basic freedoms, and the right to participate in government, all under the rule of law. Well, that's a lot of words. What am I saying here? One of the things we know about markets is that while they are good for democracy, they tend to create inequality. We can all think of someone who has a better car than us, a better home than us, right? We know that our society is not necessarily equal. So I'm going to ask you, I'm starting here, I'm going to do my yoga stretches for the morning. Let's presume we start off at a completely equal society. I'm going to tilt. You tell me where you think the inequality in the United States is at. Tell me when to stop.
Keep going.
Keep going?
Keep going.
All right, I can't keep going. Inequality is large in the United States, and again, I have slides that I think will hopefully prove that. But why are we concerned about inequality? Well, and what does inequality have to do with the middle class? What does a middle class do, or the creation of a middle class do, that sort of helps to mediate the worst effects of inequality? Yeah?
It kind of adds like a middle ground between the very poor and the very rich.
Mm-hmm. So what you're sort of saying is, if we just have that yoga pose, this sort of polarization, right, of inequality, then all we have on one side are the haves and the have-nots. Well, what kind of society are we going to get with that way? If I'm one of the have-nots looking at the have with the Bentley and the yacht, what might I think?
Revolution.
Revolution. Maybe I might think revolution. Maybe I might think, why does this guy or this gal have so much and I have so little? It might be in my interest, in the interest of those around me, to protest. Well, we might protest and we might go and try to take those things that we feel are unfairly given to the haves. If I'm the haves looking at the have-nots, what are you, and they're coming towards me, what am I going to do? Am I going to willingly give things up? So tax season is coming. How many people are willingly paying their taxes? Right, that's the chuckle is all I need. So what are we going to do? If we're the haves, we're here with their yachts, we don't want to give them to them. These people are protesting, well, what are we going to try and do?
Run away.
Run away? Maybe we'll run away, as in the Monty Python sketch. But what are we more apt to do? Probably we won't run away. We have no incentive to run away. We have most of the resources. What are we more apt to do? Fight. Protest. Repression of protest, right? Well, what does the middle class do? I think you said it. Puts this thing in the middle, this sort of, as people in my class often call it, a balancer, right? So suddenly we have a middle class, we have this middle ground here, we have people who have just enough property, just enough economic security that they fear losing it, while at the same time they know they can advance, right? Well, why does that make the system more stable? Well, because it means that as long as you both have the prospect to advance and the fear to fall behind, you're going to want to make sure the state does stuff for you. You're going to want to make sure that the state protects your property rights so that either the have-nots or the haves can't take them. You're going to want public education. Why would you want public education? When we consider advancement in our society, generally we consider education to be one of the things that helps you advance and get out of your current station and into a better one, right? So of course the middle class is going to demand education. It's going to want basic freedoms. Again, if we had a constant society where there's protest and repression, how can we have any room for liberty or freedom at all? We're just simply in conflict. Well, here we say we want freedom and we want order. We want a peaceful freedom, where people can more or less do what they want, provided they are not harming anybody else. Basically, what Dahl is saying, and not just Dahl here, is that really the middle class is the backbone to having a democracy. Without this, you can't really claim to have a democratic country. Any questions so far? Okay. And indeed, Dahl is not the only one who's saying that the middle class matters. This is not just some figment of an old man's mind. This is an idea that's been around with us historically, both in the United States and even prior to that for a long time. Indeed, one of the biggest objections by anti-federalists to the Constitution was that the representation that the Constitution gives us wouldn't represent the middle class. They were worried that the amount of representatives was too small to accurately depict the population that would be electing them, and that congressional seats would resultingly have a class bias and tend to corruption. The Pennsylvania minority, the people in Pennsylvania who said why they opposed the Constitution, said the following: "Thus it appears that the liberties, happiness, interests, and great concerns of the whole United States may be dependent upon the integrity, virtue, wisdom, and knowledge of 25 or 26 men." How inadequate and unsafe a representation. Inadequate because the sense and views of millions of people cannot be collected in so small a body, and other orders in society, such as farmers, traders, and mechanics, who will all ought to have a competent number of their best informed men in the legislature, will be totally unrepresented. So what is he saying here? He actually also mentions in this piece the middling classes. He's saying his biggest fear of the adoption of the Constitution was this document doesn't guarantee middle class representation. And if it doesn't guarantee middle class representation, we're going to have a tyranny. So this is at the American founding even, there's a discussion of where the middle class fits in the governing system. I found this quote on an investment trends analyst's page. It's Mr. Doug Casey. Again, he's an investor. He writes a newsletter. And he said something. He said that fear is the lowest common denominator of the middle class. What does that mean? When I say to you, buddy, you've reached the lowest common denominator, what am I saying about somebody?
Can't go any lower.
You can't go any lower. You've gone to the base, the worst you can possibly be. You're at the lowest common denominator. So what is Doug Casey saying in this quote? What is he trying to sort of summarize? He's saying that fear is the worst aspect of having the middle class. Why would this be? So we say middle class is good. Here's the haves. Here's the have-nots. Middle class comes in as a balancing act, right? That's good. That's good for democracy. Dahl says it. Certainly other people believed it at other points in time. But we have to remember this about the middle class. Yes, it's good that they're able to look forward and advance, and they are afraid of falling behind. And it's good that they're afraid of falling behind because they're going to make sure that the state stays active and honest to keep them from falling behind. But in fearing falling behind, there's a lot of ugliness that goes with that, right? Anytime we feel that our security is threatened, we tend not to think rationally, perhaps. But I don't want you to take my word for it because I think there are far more articulate and intelligent people on this subject out there. What I'd like to do is show you a clip from a cultural theorist named Slavoj Žižek from Slovenia. He's pretty popular and fairly controversial. What is he discussing in this clip? Well, he's discussing elections in Europe over the last 10 years. And he comes to some interesting conclusions. First of all, how many people know about the 2010 elections, the midterm elections here, the Tea Party? Show of hands. Tea Party. Okay, so what did the Tea Party run on? They won the House of Representatives on the platform. So what did they run on?
Small government.
Okay, small government. What else? What were the other buzzwords we heard? Healthcare, opposition to healthcare, right? Healthcare was socialism, right? If we socialize medicine, if we give people the ability to get health insurance or give them a public option, we will become a socialist country. Were there questions about immigration, perhaps, or immigration in the Tea Party platform that seemed a little bit controversial, shocking? So you're nodding. What can you remember from the coverage you saw?
Well, kind of leading to your point is that they want to protect the borders, kind of become a bit more isolated in that sense, and a lot of finger pointing to other groups, kind of almost hate speech in some cases toward other groups.
So some have said that that there was hate speech, and that actually a lot of the Tea Party rhetoric of small government and fear of socialism was really covering up something more fundamental about race relations. Whether that's true or not, we have to evaluate. But what's interesting is, as this Tea Party message, no government, secure the borders, get the illegals out, as that message resonated here in the United States, it's been resonating in Europe at the same time. So we might like to think that these Tea Party things, these sort of what we would call in political science nationalist movements, are relegated only to the United States and only to this bad economy in this particular period. Mr. Zizek says there's bigger things going on here. So what I'd like to do is, and God willing the internet works, show us what he has to say about the tea parties of Europe.
It might be on the wall.
Do it on the computer.
There was a mute on that last screen you had.
Was?
Far bottom right, yep.
Mark, did you see a mute?
He just got it off, clicked it off.
Okay. Medium Maven.
Dude, you don't know how to.
Now they live with us.
For any radio station to take is over 250 R. We turn now to Europe, where many are concerned about the growing acceptability of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. Far from just being expressed by the extreme right, the anti-immigrant trend has entered the mainstream. German Chancellor Angela Merkel told a gathering of young members of a conservative Christian Democratic Union Party this weekend, multiculturalism has utterly failed.
Frankfurt am Main ist bei den Kindern unter 5 Jahren von 3.
In Frankfurt on the Main, 2 out of 3 children under the age of 5 have an immigrant background. We are a country which at the beginning of the 1960s actually brought guest workers to Germany. Now they live with us, and we lied to ourselves for a while, saying that they won't stay and that they will disappear one day. That's not the reality. This multicultural approach, saying that we simply live side by side and are happy about each other, this approach has failed, utterly failed.
The German Chancellor later added, immigrants were welcome in Germany and that Islam is a part of the nation's modern-day culture. Her comments are seen as part of a rightward shift and come just days after a study by the center-left Richard Ebert Foundation found that more than 30% of people believe Germany is, quote, overrun by foreigners. A similar number believed immigrants had come to Germany for its social benefits and, quote, should be sent home when jobs are scarce. Earlier this year, a book by an influential bank executive in Germany created an uproar because it blamed the decline of German nationhood on the alleged failure of many immigrants to integrate. As the debates rage on in Europe, I'm joined here in New York by a controversial public intellectual who's been called the Elvis of cultural theory. Yes, I'm talking about the Slovenian philosopher and critic Slavoj Žižek. He's the author of over 30 books. His latest, From Verso, is just out, and it's called Living in the End Times. In a recent piece for the Guardian newspaper of London, he argues that across Europe, the politics of the far right is infecting everyone with the need for a reasonable anti-immigration policy. Well, Slavoj Žižek, welcome to Democracy Now!
Glad to be here, thank you.
Put everything together for us, from Angela Merkel talking about the end of multiculturalism, even what that means, multiculturalism, to the mass protests that are taking place in France and beyond.
I really think that usually we Europeans were a little bit arrogant, like we are the model of tolerance and so on. Now something horrible has happened, and what is really worrying is that it's not only the countries, the parts of Europe that we usually associate with intolerance, like Southeastern Europe, Romania, Hungary, and so on. It's even the very models of tolerance, Netherlands, Norway, and so on. What really worries me is, I will say something very simple, almost commonsensical, that, you know, for me, I'm here always for censorship. True democracy, tolerance in an authentic sense, means that you simply cannot say certain things publicly. You are considered, you know, like if you say publicly an anti-Semitic sexist joke, it's unacceptable. Things which were unacceptable 10, 15 years ago are now acceptable. And what I really am worried about is how the far right, what was 20 years ago the domain of the far right, is setting, even if they are a minority, they are setting the general agenda. The typical rhetorical trick here is in two moves. First, you of course condemn the far right, no place in our developed democracy, but then you add, but they are addressing the real worries of the people and so on and so on. So, in precisely, that's the sophistic trick, in order to prevent hatred outbursts, we have to control the situation. You know what is significant about Sarrazin, the banker that you mentioned? You know that he was politically close to social democracy.
Which means?
Which means that they really, the extreme right, imposed their topic onto everyone. But let me tell you now something which may surprise you. I of course don't accept this horrible logic. We have to do it more modestly to prevent real outbursts. But I think there is a failure in this standard liberal multicultural vision, which means every ethnic group, whatever, to itself, all we need is a neutral legal framework guaranteeing the coexistence of groups. Sorry if I shock someone, but I think we do need what Germans call Leitkultur, a leading culture. Just, it shouldn't be nationally defined. We should fight for that. Yes, I agree with right-wingers. We need a set of values accepted by all. But what will these values be, my God? We neglected this a little bit. You know that it's not just this abstract liberal model. You have your world, I have my world. We just need a neutral legal network, how we politely ignore each other. My second point would have been that it's absolutely crucial how this anti-immigrant explosion is linked to the withdrawal of leftist politics, especially in the matters of economy and so on. It is as if the left being obsessed by the idea that we shouldn't appear as reactionary in the economic sense. That is to say that no, we are not the old trade union representatives of the working class. We are for postmodern digital capitalism and so on. They don't want to touch the working class or so-called lower ordinary people, and here right-wingers enter. Do you know the horrible paradox is that, apart from some small leftist fringe parties, the only serious political force in Europe today which still is ready to appeal to the ordinary working people are the right-wing anti-immigrants. So you see, we, the leftists, we have no right, absolutely no right to take this arrogant view of offended, tolerant people, oh, horror. No, we should ask the question how we enable what is going on.
I want to ask you about this Christian Science Monitor poll that showed 13% of Germans would welcome the arrival of a new Führer. More than a third of Germans feel the country is overrun by foreigners. Roughly 60% would restrict the practice of Islam, and 17% believe Jews have too much influence. 13% would welcome the arrival of a new Führer.
I think, now again, I will maybe shock you, but don't exaggerate the meaning of this. No, I think that, okay, my first thesis, that Germany, and this makes it all the more tragic, from my personal experience, Germany is, for example, far more effectively in everyday life tolerant than France, for example. I claim it all responsibility. It's not as general as it may appear. Go to mixed part of ex-West Berlin and so on, you will still see wonderful collaboration. Don't worry about this. What I'm just saying is that we shouldn't get too fascinated by these details. We should ask more fundamental questions. Like, this is for me only part of a general shift, which I mentioned in the text you kindly referred to, how the whole political mapping of Europe is changing in a horrible way. To cut a long story short, very briefly, till now we had the standard situation that you also had it up to till now here. One big left-of-center party, one big right-of-center party. They are the only two parties which address the entire population, and then small fringe parties. Now, more and more in Europe, another polarity is emerging. A big liberal capitalist party, which can even be in social matters like abortion, women's rights, relatively progressive, pure, let's call it capitalist party, and the only serious opposition is the anti-immigrant nationalists. It's something horrible that has happened. The anti-immigrants are establishing themselves as the only authentic, of course they are not authentic politically, but in the sense of really experienced as authentic, voice of protest. If you want to protest, the only way to do it effectively in Europe is this. So I think it's a matter of life and death for a slightly more radical left to emerge. You know what Walter Benjamin, the great Frankfurt School fellow, he said something which we should always bear in mind today. He said, behind every fascism, there is a failed revolution. It goes more than ever for us. Let's take your own country, Kansas, which is now the bedrock of Christian fundamentalism. As Thomas Frank demonstrated in his book, my God, till 20, 30 years ago, Kansas was the breeding ground of all radical socialist and so on mass movements. The same in Europe. This should worry us, not this arrogant, which always has a negative class connotation. When people attack common people's racism, it's always like we upper middle class liberals dismissing ordinary people. We should start asking ourselves what we did wrong.
And as you come here to the United States, your assessment of the Tea Party movement?
It's a perfect example of what I was talking about. I had almost, I use the terms a little bit ironically, but nonetheless, a kind of epiphany moment when a year ago or so, when they organized grassroots Republicans, all those, the first wave of tea parties against spending so much money for banks. You know what I was doing? I was sitting in a hotel room, jumping between two channels on TV. One was Fox News, you must know the enemy to fight it. The other one was PBS. On Fox News, it was a live transmission of a tea party in Texas, where a singer, kind of a fake folk singer, was singing anti-Washington, anti-state expenditure song. On PBS, there was a documentary on the great leftist icon Pete Seeger. I was shocked at how the words, although the political minister, were almost the same. Both were singing about we small, ordinary people are exploited, big bad guys, bankers in Washington and so on, Wall Street and so on. This is the tragedy. This is the tragedy at its purest. You must know better than me. I don't know it, as far as I can judge the situations. It was after Carter with Reagan when this grassroots movement and so on were more taken over by the right, like, you know, the time of leftist radical mass mobilization has passed now. When somebody tells you, oh, Tea Party, oh, out of a local grassroots protest, your first association is right-wingers again doing it or what. This is a very sad moment, but no reasons, I hope I made it clear, for traditional European America bashing. And this is, I think, part of a global process of what I call the disappearance of these, what philosophers like Kant called the public use of reason. I listened with amazement and great pleasure to the report about how here in the States the university, which are financed by taxpayers' money, are more and more used by companies. In Europe we are even worse. I tell you why. Because they stated clearly the problem in Europe. It's not only this concrete problem, big companies controlling through money donations universities. It's something more fundamental going on. It's a well-organized all-European campaign to turn us, scientists, human or natural, into experts. The idea is, we have a problem, let's say oil spill in Louisiana. Oh, we need experts to tell us how to contain it. We have a public disorder demonstrations. We need psychologists and so on. This is not thinking. What universities should do is not serve as experts to those in power who define the problems. We should redefine and question the problems themselves. Is this the right perception of the problem? Is this really the problem? We should ask much more fundamental questions. Here, it may surprise you, but I still have sympathy for Obama. But in my view, one of his greatest failures is not Afghanistan. There the situation is very complex. I don't know what I would have done. It's how he reacted to the oil spill. You know why? Because he played this legal moralistic game, as if the problem, you know, like, I will kick, we know where BP, they will make, sorry, but in a tragedy of these proportions, you cannot play this legalistic game, who is guilty and so on. You should start asking more general questions. BP is evil, but are we aware that it may have happened also to another company? So the problem is not BP. The problems are much more general. The structure of our economy, why are we living like this, our way of life, and so on and so on. I think that this is the problem today. I'm saying this ironically as a leftist. We have maybe even too much anti-capitalism, but in this overload of anti-capitalism, but always in this legal, moralistic sense. Oh, that company is using child slave labor. Oh, that company is polluting. Oh, that company is, that company, whatever, is exploiting our universities. No, the problem is more fundamental. It's about how the whole system works to make the companies do this. Don't moralize the problem. Because if you moralize it, you can say in the States whatever you want. Already in the movies like Pelican Brief, you remember. No problem, big company, even the president of the United States can be corrupted. No, this excess of anti-capitalism is a false excess. We should start asking more fundamental questions.
Slava Žižek, your latest book.
So I realized I let him talk for a while again. This is probably because he's far more articulate than I am, and because there's a lot in there that I think we need to address. The first question we need to ask is this. So Mr. Zizek says, okay, whether it's the Tea Parties in America or the fringe parties in Europe that are similar to Tea Parties, this is a concern of ours. This should be a concern. Why does he say it should be a concern? He says, because if we're in a democracy, yes, we value freedom of speech. I'm not going to say we don't. If we do not have freedom of speech, as students from my class will tell us, we do not have democracy. At the same time, generally when we are living in a democracy, we say we have some sort of shared values that we're not going to transgress, right? And so what he's saying at the beginning of this clip is, in a modern democracy, we say we're not going to tolerate racism. We're not going to tolerate you making a sexist or anti-Semitic joke in public. If you were to do it here, you'd probably be asked to leave, right? Probably in a lot of classrooms as well. Well, what he's saying is that the first thing that we have to be disturbed by is not necessarily this poll about Germans and, well, maybe they want a new Hitler. He's asking there's something more fundamental we have to be disturbed by here. And he says it right at the beginning of the interview, and he says, things that we had settled, things that were accepted for most of our history are suddenly up for debate again. And not necessarily things that should be up for debate if we consider ourselves to be a progressive living democracy. So for example, what are some of these things? Well, he doesn't really get into it, but what did the Tea Party run on? A lot of the Tea Party people ran on getting rid of at least one provision of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. What does the 14th Amendment of the Constitution do? Anyone know? Well, I know, yes. The history professor ought to know.
Due process.
Due process. Could you explain it a little more than this?
No.
No, absolutely. Essentially, the 14th Amendment, which happened after emancipation of slaves, says that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. More importantly than that, you cannot be denied the equal protection of the laws of both the federal and the state governments. Suddenly, we have people who won an election in the House of Representatives on the idea, partially, of repealing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Civil rights legislation. So, in the 1960s, we have the Civil Rights Acts passed that say, if you own a public place, right, or you own a restaurant, you cannot discriminate as to who goes into that restaurant. Well, Rand Paul, son of Ron Paul, made the argument that we really have to get rid of these silly civil rights laws and that private people should be allowed to discriminate. Maybe you believe that, but at the same time, these were things that, the point being, they were settled, right? They were settled in legislation, they were settled in our norms, and suddenly they're up for debate. Suddenly, things are being challenged again. Why is that? Well, he says the easiest thing we could do is say, well, the Tea Partiers are just rednecks, right? That would be the easy thing. Blame all these people as just being rednecks and racist. He says that's not what we should do, though. He says that if people are following nationalist beliefs now, or more open to them, it is not the fault of the people themselves. He says there is someone we should blame, though. Who does he say we should blame from this clip? He says we should blame the fact that there's no protest going on, right? So we like to think of things, and I think, put it out, left versus right. I'd like to put that aside for a minute and say that instead what we have are forces of reaction and forces of protest. Well, what happens when the forces of protest go silent? Well, what he says is that when the voices of protest go silent, the public use of reason stops. So what's the connection here? Remember, in a society where we have a healthy middle class, we're supposed to be balanced between the haves and have-nots. We're supposed to have some sort of consensus generally reached by the middle class as to how we're going to operate our society. Suddenly we yank the middle class out of the equation. Well, what did we say we would have before if we don't have a middle class in the equation?
People with and people without.
We would have a polarized society and conflict. Well, that's generally what we've had before. And usually when we have that, we have protest, as we said, right? Well, what happens if the people who were supposed to be protesting, who were supposed to be the radical people pushing the have-not, the haves to give up a little more to save society, what if those people aren't there anymore? What actually Mr. Zizek is saying is what those people did, what we consider the left, what we consider the voices of protest, was around 1980 they quit. They said instead of economic equality or redistributing wealth, we're just going to concentrate on making everyone equal under the law. And as long as everyone has equal legal rights, we'll be okay and we can ignore each other. We don't have to worry about shared values, that's okay, because we're all equal under the law. Does anyone see a problem with just having people equal under the law? So, as United States citizens, sure, we're equal under the law. In theory, the president can go to jail just as much as I can. But is the law truly equal? If I were to ask for a show of hands who think that our current justice code is equal or fair, how many people think our current criminal justice system is fair? Or is everyone just too scared to actually make an opinion seem controversial? Okay.
Mostly fair.
Mostly fair.
It's fair to a lot of us.
In what way?
Well, in the sense that those who have prestige and power are treated fairly, more so than those who don't.
If I were to go into, if two people were to be convicted of drugs, me and I'm dressed like this going into courtroom and someone else wearing jeans and perhaps not having this skin color, who's probably going to get the better end of the deal?
Right.
Me. Okay, so we say, okay, then that doesn't work. Things are breaking down and there's no protest here to stop it. There's no voice of protest. Well, if there's no voice of protest, two things can happen. Maybe people just start getting violent in general without any direction towards them. Or maybe they just stay put and the people who are the haves say, hey, there's no one protesting anymore. What could I do? Well, no one's going to protest me. Why don't I take more of what they have and add to my money, right? And add to my power. This is what Mr. Zizek is saying is what the far right is doing. Is that it's a rhetorical trick. This is what he calls it. What he's saying is that in the absence of these ordinary people or anyone looking out for ordinary people through protest, what gets to happen is that the people who are the haves, and especially the far rights of the haves, and they are a minority in our society, start setting the agenda. Well, they're not going to tell us that the real problem is the big banks. They're not going to tell us that the real problem is corporations and corporate rule. What are they going to tell us? Blame the immigrant. Blame the person who's different than you. This is what I think Mr. Zizek means when he says that we've lost the public use of reason. What I think he's saying here, and again, I'm going to get to examples of this, is he's saying that when you lose a middle class, you allow the people with the power to set the agenda. The people with the power who set the agenda very often don't want people to reason, because reasoning often can lead to protest. If we reason, we're getting screwed. So, fun with election results. These are done from exit polls after the 2010 midterm election. I want to sort of think about whether they show in some way a loss of the public use of reason, at least among certain parts of our society. Well, in 2010, Democrats won the vote of those making under $50,000 a year by 37%. This would probably speak to the idea that perhaps there is some public use of reason left, because again, if we consider, not that the Democratic Party is a voice of protest, but generally the idea that there is at least someone pushing social reforms and redistribution, well, it makes sense. People are voting their economic interests. You make under 50K, of course I'm not going to vote for someone who's going to not give me a tax cut or give a tax cut to a millionaire instead. Well, let's broaden this. Let's make it 30,000 to 100,000. This is generally considered by social scientists the middle class of American society. Now, most people, if I ask you, is 30 grand enough to live on? Or would shake their heads like you're absurd, right? And I would agree. Living on the salary I live on now, which I'm not going to tell you, but it's public, so you can probably look it up, it's hard enough to live, and it's more than 30 grand, right? Nonetheless, for social science purposes, we tend to say that the middle class is between wage earners between 30 and 100 grand. Well, Tea Party Republicans won the middle class by 34%. They won the people who are supposed to be the reasoners, the balancers, by 34% in the 2010 midterm election. So what? Well, the statistic that popped out to me when these stats were given to me by one of my colleagues was that Republicans won college graduates by 12%. Why might this statistic speak to the loss of the public use of reason? Yeah.
College grads are usually the ones that protest the most. They've got the ideas in their head, they want change.
Well, that could be one reason. I could also ask the question, why is it here at Middlesex or at any college, why do we make you take general education classes? Is it because we're evil bastards who like to torture you? Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. Is there a second reason we do it? Yeah. We want to make you well-rounded people. That's why we call it a liberal arts program. The idea is we're exposing you to multiple things to increase your reasoning capacities and make you a good citizen. That is generally the idea of why these things started. I recognize that even I, as an undergrad, thought it was just torture, but there is a logic behind it. It's to make you a well-rounded person, a person who can reason, right? And when I'm saying this stuff, I'm not saying that, oh, it's terrible that college graduates are voting Republican and are conservative. I'm saying that generally speaking, through a liberal arts education, one of the goals we come out with is to make you a more tolerant citizen, right? I don't think that's a controversial statement, and I apologize if it is, but I think one of the goals of a liberal arts education is to make you a more tolerant citizen. So when we see that college graduates, who historically, by the way, the other thing is this is an anomaly. College graduates, the number tends to generally be a little bit more split in terms of how they vote. The fact that college graduates voted for Tea Party candidates, nationalist candidates, by 12%, that's kind of scary. I think it speaks to the idea of the public use of reason.
One thing, so it says that Republicans won the vote, those making 30 to 100K by 34%. Do you mean Tea Party Republicans, or do you mean the Republican Party?
Well, this is the Republican Party. What I'm saying is I'm basing it on the fact that even mainstream Republicans sort of use Tea Party rhetoric in their platforms in the 2010 elections. So what I'm saying is that the Tea Party drove the 2010 elections. Again, I don't think this would be a controversial statement among most people. So even Republicans who we would other consider more mainstream conservatives certainly followed the Tea Party's sort of line of reasoning to win in 2010. Of course, that also might go to what Mr. Zizek says, right? That the far right is setting the agenda, so even the sensible right-wingers don't even have a chance to get their voices in. But maybe what should disturb us the most, well, in 2010, Republicans won the vote of those making over 100,000 by 18%. I don't think that would be much of a surprise. But maybe what should really disturb us is voter turnout here. For the midterm election, this 2010 election, voter turnout, the eligible amount of people who are eligible to vote, the amount of people who actually turned out was about 42%. That's scary. Why is that scary? Why would it be easier for a minority or an extremist viewpoint to get into the public or the political arena because of low turnout? What's the relationship here? Well, 42% is certainly less. It means that a less than a majority of us who have the right to vote are voting. So what does that do to the people who are voting?
Gives them more power.
Gives them a lot more power. So what if you can get just a small group of people pissed off enough that they're willing to mobilize while everyone else just sits around? That's how the right wing or a nationalist type of viewpoint might be able to set the agenda. One thing I haven't done yet, though, is I call this the death of the middle class, so I have to prove to you that the middle class is dead. These statistics come to us from Mother Jones Magazine by way of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government agencies, including the Congressional Budget Office. What I wanted us to look at this particular graph really is look at the red line on both of them. The first, on the left, we have average household income. This goes from 1979 to the year 2007. The average household income of a family before taxes. If you were in the top 1%, that means the top 1% of earners in this country, you saw your household income from 1979 to the year 2007 rise to about $2 million from $500,000. If you were in the third, fourth, or bottom 20%, your average household income for all intents and purposes has stayed the same since 1979. Change in income, so this is sort of what this means in the larger context. Change in share of income versus 1979 after taxes. The top 1% have seen, of wage earners in this country, have seen their income increase 150% since 1979. Everyone else has seen a loss in terms of their actual income, according to the Congressional Budget Office. In fact, if you are in the lowest 20% in this society, your actual share of income dropped by almost negative 30%. Continue. Top graphic is the actual distribution of wealth in American society. The bright yellow is the top 20%, the gold is the second 20%, red third 20%, so on and so forth. again, just sort of shows the same thing. The top 1% owns most of the wealth, almost all of the wealth. The second, and this comes from a business school poll done at Duke, asks they asked Americans, what do you think the distribution of wealth is? Well, Americans think it's a little bit more equal than it is, but it seems to me up here that people still recognize fundamentally that there's a lot of inequality going on, right? Especially when the question was asked, what would you like income distribution? What would you like the wealth distribution to be in the United States? And that's the last one. Well, that seems a lot more even. That seems, first of all, we could say Americans certainly aren't socialists. They don't mind that a top 1% is making its money, right? Maybe because we all believe we're going to get there. But it seems that they want everyone else to be a little bit better off as well. Bureau of Labor Statistics is where we get these stats, along with the Federal Reserve. This is between 2007 and 2009. Wall Street profits between 2007 and 2009 were up 720%. At the same time, between 2007 and 2009, the unemployment rate jumped up 102%. In that same period, Americans' home equity, what is home equity? The value of your home, the value of American homes plummeted 35%. Currently, the average CEO of a company makes 185 times more than the average worker. Purchasing power of the dollar, how much that money in your wallet actually buys you over time. And what have we noticed? Right now in the year 2000, according to the investletters.com and I think they get a lot of their information again through the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other things, we've seen the dollar fall to at least half of its original purchasing power in 1900. What does that mean? It means your money doesn't buy as much. Well, the question is then, if we look at these trends and we look at the way that wealth is distributed in this country, it doesn't look to me like we have much of a middle class, does it? If we're to go back here, actual distribution of wealth, where's the middle there? It seems like we have a whole bunch of yellow, and what we consider the middle, that 3rd and 4%, have a little sliver of the pie, if any. So if we don't have a middle class, why is it that people still think they're middle class? If I were to ask people in this room, show of hands, how many people say they're middle class? I'll be the first one to put my hands up. Yeah, it's okay. It's no judgment here. We all say we're middle class. Well, what has allowed us to keep living middle class when we don't actually have the wealth to do so? So let me look through my wallet here. Let's see. There's a Chase one. There's a MasterCard. What has allowed us to live like middle class people even if we don't have the middle class wages anymore? Credit. Household debt, this comes from the Federal Reserve from 1966 to 2006. Home mortgage debt skyrocketed. Consumer credit, average household debt by the year 2006, people were carrying about $13,000 in consumer credit debt. Well, we feel rich. What's the problem with debt? You got to pay it back, right? The piper has to get paid. Or if the piper isn't going to get paid right away, he's at least going to want interest. Voter turnout by income. Again, just to sort of emphasize the point here of how it is that we sort of get these sort of extreme movements when we lose middle classes. This comes from Dollars and Cents magazine. I know it's a little tough to read. Basically, though, they break wage earners again into quintiles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over here we have the darker color says that this was the amount of people in that income bracket that voted. Over here is the people who voted for the Democrat, again, presumably the more left of center candidate, the one who would redistribute wealth more. What we notice in most elections, and this goes from 1980 to 2000, is that turnout for the highest quintile, the highest amount of rated wage earners, is almost always around 90%. Somewhere between 87 and 90%. For people in the lowest quintile, it's about 50% or worse. Ironically, though, when people on the lower income bracket turn out, they do vote for the more progressive candidate, by and large. But they don't turn out. So if they're not turning out again, why would we expect them to have any say in what the agenda is? Why would we expect the agenda to reflect what they're thinking, right? Just to sort of bring it home again, the dynamics here. In the 2004 election, if you made under $15,000, you voted for John Kerry by 63%. By the time we get into I'd say what the middle class really would be about nowadays, you're still voting at about half and half. By the time you're making $200,000 more, you're overwhelmingly voting for George W. Bush. Again, just to say, there's a class skew here. There's a class skew in turnout, and there's a class skew in how we're voting. So why aren't people turning out then? Why is it that so many people have decided it's just not worth my time anymore, right? Well, maybe it has something to do with campaign finance. This was Obama versus McCain in 2008. Really what I would want us to focus on is the top 5 or 6 for both of them. So we have Obama on the left, McCain on the right. What are some of the names, for those who can see and have good eyesight, that seem similar in the top few donors to both major presidential candidates?
Banks and corporations. Banks and
corporations. So we see that Goldman Sachs is in the top 5 for both presidential candidates, as is JP Morgan Chase. We also see a lot of Ivy League universities there and defense contractors. Perhaps the reason we don't turn out is because we see things like this and wonder what's the point, right? Seeing this is sort of a depressing statistic, is it not? Generally speaking, if we give people money in some form, we expect a service in return. Is this not a fee-for-service system? One has to wonder. So what? In the end, what do we know happens when inequality becomes too extreme to foster a middle class? I could sit here all day and talk about we are more subject to nationalist ideologies and extreme viewpoints, but that doesn't objectively show that this is happening. I'd like to say it is. In fact, all you have to do is turn on Fox News for 8 minutes at 8 p.m. and you will see it happening. So, a few clips here. The first one is a combination of things from Bill O'Reilly from both Fox News and his radio show. I want to see if what he's talking about might relate to what Mr. Zizek was talking about the loss of the public use of reason.
We came because we believe that we can change all this. We believe what was said about this country in the earliest days of our revolution, that we have it within our power to begin the world anew.
Then why do so many people want to come here so bad?
Because there are places where they can do good here. If we allow for that to happen and we create change.
Change. So that means a changing America. You want a change.
Of course America has to change.
Right. And you'd like the changing America to be the dominant people would be people of color.
All right, there you go. White privilege, the browning of America. There it is. There it is. Bottom line on this, that's what it is. Change the complexion of America. Have an open border where Hispanics, people who live in the Caribbean, people who live in Africa and Asia can walk in and become citizens immediately. And there you have the white power structure would decline, of course, because the numbers of people coming here would be people of color, right? That's a hidden agenda. See, nobody will say it. Nobody will say it. That's what it's all about.
Change upon the whole complexion of America. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. The second thing that they're on the left they're against is the temporary worker, as you know. We say 2 years, go back for a year, 2 years, go back for a year. They don't want that. They don't want them to have to go back.
But the strategy is,
people can come and work.
do you understand, and I'm not saying this in a condescending way, you're smarter than I am, but do you understand what the New York Times wants and the far left want? They want to break down the white Christian male power structure, which you're a part, and so am I. And they want to bring in millions of foreign nationals to basically break down the structure that we have. In that regard, Pat Buchanan is right.
Mr. O'Reilly came around the barricade and grabbed onto me, both his hands, started shoving me a little in.
Well, it's a total violation of press freedom, so I had no choice, ladies and gentlemen, but to uphold the Constitution.
No, you're not. You're blocking his stop. I've never seen a member of the press put hands on a staff member before.
That's really low class, pal. Really low class.
No one on this earth is going to block a shot.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. It is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, you will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
One more clip here, and for those of you who have to go eat lunch, please do. I don't need anyone with low blood sugar here, but one last clip, and then we can get to questions. This clip comes from Rachel Maddow's show.
Joining us now is
Pat Buchanan discussing, this was the time that now Justice Sonia Sotomayor, it was during her confirmation hearings. Pat Buchanan had some issues, perhaps, with Ms. Sotomayor getting a seat on the highest court of the land, and he went on Rachel Maddow's show on MSNBC to talk about them. Again, does Mr. Buchanan's speech, if you will, give us some indication of the public loss of reason?
NBC political colleague, Pat Buchanan. Pat, it's been far too long since you've been on the show. It's really nice to see you.
Good to see you, Rachel.
So, your argument is that Republicans could reap political rewards by making the argument that Sotomayor essentially doesn't deserve to be on the Supreme Court, that she's only there because of her race. Is that, did I understand your argument correctly?
Well, I think I would vote no on Sonia Sotomayor the same way I would have voted no on Harriet Miers, and I said so the first day she was nominated. I don't think Judge Sotomayor is qualified for the United States Supreme Court. She has not shown any great intellect here or any great depth of knowledge of the Constitution. She's never written anything that I've read in terms of a law review article or a major book or something like that on the law. And I do believe she's an affirmative action appointment by the President of the United States. He eliminated everyone but 4 women, and then he picked a Hispanic. So I think this is an affirmative action appointment, and I would vote no.
What do you think that affirmative action is for?
Affirmative action is to increase diversity by discriminating against white males. As Alan Bakke was discriminated at the University of California at Davis, as Brian Weber, that worker in Louisiana, was discriminated against, as Frank Rickey and those firefighters were discriminated against, as Jennifer Gratz was discriminated against and kept out of the University of Michigan, which she set her heart on, even though her grades were far higher than people who were allowed in there. That's the type. Affirmative action is basically reverse discrimination against white males, and it's as wrong as discrimination against black females and Hispanics and others, and that's why I oppose it.
I obviously have a different view about it, but I want to give you a chance to explain what you...
But why do you have a different view?
Well, let me ask you this. Why do you think it is that of the 110 Supreme Court justices we've had in this country, 108 of them have been white?
Well, I think white men were 100% of the people who wrote the Constitution, 100% of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, 100% of the people who died in Gettysburg and Vicksburg, probably close to 100% of the people who died in Normandy. This has been a country built basically by white folks in this country who were 90% of the entire nation in 1960 when I was growing up, Rachel, and the other 10% were African Americans who had been discriminated against. That's why.
But does that mean that you think that there are 108?
So I'll stop you right there because they just devolve, as most talk shows do, screaming slightly after that. But what is Mr. Buchanan and Mr. O'Reilly saying to the disaffected, pissed off? What is he saying to them? Remember, if no one else is saying anything, someone's going to be talking. Well, what are they telling them here? What are they telling people? Oh, if you vote for Obama, oh, if you have Sonia Sotomayor on the court. What is the fear that they're sort of trying to drum up? The browning of America. That's what Bill O'Reilly calls it, the browning of America.
They'll take from you.
They'll take from you. So what is Mr. Buchanan saying in that last speech? Remember, it was white men who built this nation. What's going on here is we're seeing them try to take away your privilege, your power, your rights, that your history, right? Your story is going to be erased if we allow things to continue this way. Well, that can be a lot of fear, right? It can be a great way to raise fear.
Isn't it racist in itself to say that because they're white, we can't have it anymore?
Is it racist in their...
Yeah, because you're saying it's a big deal because everyone's white that's in the government, pretty much. Isn't that racist in itself because they're discriminating against white people?
If the criticism is of affirmative action as a policy, which are things what you're doing, I think there's valid reasons to say that affirmative action doesn't work, and it actually has probably contributed to sort of this backlash. And again, if most of the government is still white, we can't even say it's really effectively helped with diversity. My personal viewpoint is that we should do something that a lot of states do, where if you're in the top 10% of your high school, you're guaranteed college admission. I know California was doing that for a while. I don't know if they still do. But anyway, I would just like to end it with those clips and asking the question, if I have proven, as I hope I have, that there really isn't much of a middle class anymore, or what's left of it is dwindling, what are the political consequences of that? And more importantly, as people who are at an institution where we're supposed to value reasoning, what happens when the center cannot hold and we lose the power of public reason? So that's where I'll end it and take questions.
Just I want to make one statement, just how proud we all are that you joined our faculty and make a wonderful voice, and we're really glad to have you. And just before anyone leaves, in case anybody needs any of those proof of attendance, I have some with me that some of you came in later. We'll go ahead with questions.
Or we hit lunchtime and everyone's like, hey, it's nice out and it's time to go and eat. Okay, then it's lunchtime. It's nice to meet you.